When I'm making my colored collages, these are landscape collages that I've done from memory. When I'm making them, I have to often make choices about the types of paper I'm going to use. And sometimes for these collages, I'll use paper that's more store-bought, colors that I might find in like a colored construction paper, like these. This one here is just a blue piece of construction paper, and when I rip this piece, you'll see that, it maintains a blue edge. So if that's an effect I want, I'll use this type of paper. Sometimes I'll choose to use something that's painted on one side and white on the other. This is a piece of Color Aid paper. And you can also go and get paint chips from a local Home Depot or a Lowe's store. And the beautiful thing about choosing a paper like this is that when you rip it, often you get this beautiful white edge, which is sometimes an interesting element to a collage. Another thing I often do is to use a absorbent sort of rice paper. And this piece started as something like this. And I'm going to show you about hand painting both paper that has a bit more body to it, like a thicker paper, but I'm also going to show you the effect you can get by hand painting a rice paper. And over time, you might start to build your own collage palette. So over here you see yellow, red, blue, green, and purple papers. I have a huge collage palette, which is very much like what I might use if I'm using my palette for painting. But in collage, after you do multiple collages, you're going to have all this leftover color, all this leftover paper. So save it, because those remnants of your process are really beautiful possibilities for future collages. So I'm going to just show you two things. One is the possibility of using an ink, like a diluted ink. When I'm working with this thin rice paper, sometimes I like to use a dilution of watercolor, or in this case, this is just a blue ink that I bought. And I can take that very thin dilution of color, and you'll see that when I paint it onto the rice paper, I'm just going to dip my brush in here. When I paint it onto the rice paper absorbs it like a sponge. And it's actually a really beautiful effect. I pre-ripped this paper. I like to have like a lot of like random shapes of paper. I pre-ripped it. This, I don't know ultimately what I'll use it for, but I like how the ink comes right out to the edge. It's really a beautiful effect. And then, I'd let it dry, obviously. And then later on, it will become a tool that I can use. I like to have a range of value and a range of colors, even within blue, let's say. So this blue, actually this side of this paper is a matte blue, but this side is shiny. So I used actually a metallic ink for this. And then obviously the value of this is a lighter value than what I just prepared for that blue. So I'll have a range of options ultimately. So that's the effect that you might get if you hand prepare a rice paper. But other options can be using a more opaque paint, or even other shades of watercolor or ink. And on this side of the paper here, I've divided it up into several sections, and I can take, this is gouache, which is an opaque watercolor. I can come into this little gouache container, and sometimes I will just go ahead and, with an opaque color, paint in a thicker, maybe multimedia paper or an inexpensive watercolor paper, and use that for a collage. So here's a section I'm just going to paint in and ultimately let it dry, and that will be nice raw material that I can rip up, or I can cut for collage. But again, I like to have a range of values, so I'm also going to take another little bin here of gouache, and I'm going to prepare another section next to it, which is a lighter value. And that way, depending on the collage I'm making, I might have some, let's say these colors remind me of the ocean and water. So I might be doing an ocean scene where out in the distance the water has a feeling like this. Maybe closer up there might be a feeling like this. Maybe the sky has aspects that are really deep blue. So preparing your own paper gives you a lot of options, and it really allows you to create your own effects when it comes to collage making. So I invite you to experiment with different dilutions of inks, with opaque paints. So a gouache would look like something like that. That's an opaque watercolor. Regular watercolor out of the tube might look like that, and that might be a palette like this that you might develop for your hand tinting of papers. And then this here is a ink, a very diluted ink, but beautiful color that you could use. And then you can also just use regular old acrylic paint for this. So really, you may already have a lot of what you already need to hand color your own collage papers. It's a really fun process, and I think it's a great thing to play with when you're thinking about approaching collages that have a variety of materials to create them.